Imagine a king who changed the fate of a nation for love, or rather for desire. Henry VIII, the English monarch who broke from the Catholic Church, created a new religion and married 6 times. But what really drove this powerful king to such extremes, and what were the consequences of his choices? Prepare yourself for a story of passion, power, and betrayal. Henry VIII ruled England from 1509 to 1547, a period marked by political and religious transformations. Son of Henry VII, he inherited a stable kingdom, but his desire for a male heir and his passion for Anne Boleyn led him to challenge the Pope's authority and create the Anglican Church. This was just the beginning of a series of events that would shape the history of England forever. The young Henry ascended to the throne at just 17 years old, handsome, athletic, and full of ambition. Initially celebrated as a Renaissance prince, no one could have predicted how dramatically his reign would transform not just England, but the religious landscape of Europe itself. His obsession with securing the Tudor dynasty through a male heir would drive him to unprecedented actions, forever changing the relationship between church and state. What makes Henry's story so captivating isn't just the political intrigue or religious upheaval, it's the deeply human drama at its core. This was a man whose personal desires became matters of state, whose marriages were international incidents, and whose temper could determine life or death for those around him. From the devoted Catherine of Aragon to the clever Anne Boleyn, the women in Henry's life weren't merely wives, they were pivotal figures in a dangerous game of power. If you love history and want to unravel the mysteries of great empires, like this video, subscribe to Modern Age Chronicles channel and don't miss a single episode. Join us as we explore how one man's passions changed the course of history, leaving a legacy that resonates to this day. When Henry VIII claimed the English throne in 1509, he was just 17 years old, a Renaissance prince straight from a fairy tale. Tall, athletic, with fiery red-gold hair and a charismatic presence that dominated any room. The young Tudor king embodied everything his subjects hoped for: strength, vigor, and the promise of a glorious new era after the cautious reign of his father, Henry VII. His first marriage had actually been arranged years earlier, to a woman with a fascinating story of her own. Catherine of Aragon, daughter of the powerful Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, had originally come to England to marry Henry's older brother, Arthur. But when Arthur died suddenly just months after their wedding, the teenage Catherine found herself in a precarious position, a widow in a foreign land, her future uncertain. For years, Catherine remained in a diplomatic limbo, while the royal families and the Pope himself debated what should become of her. Henry VII, ever the pragmatist, wasn't eager to lose the valuable Spanish alliance, or Catherine's substantial dowry. When the old king died, young Henry made one of his first decisions as monarch. He would marry his brother's widow. The marriage required special permission from Pope Julius II, as biblical law forbade marrying a brother's wife. Catherine swore that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, making her eligible to marry Henry. The Pope granted his dispensation, and in June 1509, Henry and Catherine were wed in a quiet ceremony at Greenwich. For nearly 2 decades, their union seemed blessed. Catherine was a devoted wife and respected queen. She served as regent when Henry was away at war with France, even overseeing an English victory against Scottish invaders. She was beloved by the people for her kindness and piety. The royal couple appeared to have the perfect marriage, but beneath the surface, a crisis was brewing. Catherine gave birth to 6 children, but only one survived infancy, a daughter named Mary. In an age when male heirs were considered essential to stable succession, Henry grew increasingly anxious. By 1527, Catherine was in her 40s and unlikely to bear more children. The king began to question whether God was punishing him for marrying his brother's widow, despite the papal dispensation. As Henry's doubts grew, so did his interest in one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, the captivating Anne Boleyn. Unlike many of Henry's previous mistresses, Anne refused to yield to the king's desires without marriage, a stance that would ultimately transform the religious landscape of England forever. Did you know that Henry VIII wrote more than 70 love letters to Anne Boleyn during his passionate pursuit of her? These letters reveal a king completely besotted, referring to Anne as his darling, and signing as your loyal servant and friend. He poured his heart onto parchment, promising her the world. Yet in a tragic twist that demonstrates the mercurial nature of this powerful man, after their marriage, Henry accused Anne of treason, adultery, and even incest. The woman he had moved heaven and earth to marry would eventually face the executioner's sword at the Tower of London. It's a heartbreaking reversal of fortune. A love story that began with passionate letters and ended with a death warrant signed by the same hand. The story of Henry's first marriage reveals something profound about the intersection of personal desire and political power. What began as a diplomatic union between England and Spain would eventually trigger international crisis, religious revolution, and centuries of change that continue to shape our world today. Enter Anne Boleyn, a woman who would change the course of English history forever. Unlike the fair-haired, demure ladies typically favoured at the Tudor court, Anne stood out with her olive complexion, dark eyes, and raven hair. But it wasn't just her exotic looks that captivated the king. Anne possessed something even more alluring, a brilliant mind. Anne had spent her formative years at the sophisticated French court, where she absorbed the latest Renaissance thinking, musical talents, and the art of witty conversation. When she returned to England around 1522, she brought with her continental elegance and a certain mysterious allure that made her the focus of attention. Henry, who had previously taken Anne's sister Mary as his mistress, soon found himself utterly enchanted by this fascinating new presence at court. What made Anne truly extraordinary was her refusal to become merely another royal conquest. When Henry began pursuing her around 1526, she did something unprecedented. She said no. "I would rather lose my life than my honesty," Anne reportedly told the king. For a monarch accustomed to getting whatever he desired, this resistance only inflamed his passion further. Henry's solution seemed straightforward enough. He would divorce Catherine and marry Anne. But this simple desire would trigger one of the greatest religious upheavals in European history. The king dispatched his trusted advisor, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, to Rome, seeking an annulment from Pope Clement VII. Henry's argument was theological. He claimed his marriage to Catherine was invalid because she had been his brother's wife, citing the biblical book of Leviticus. Under normal circumstances, the Pope might have been persuaded, but timing worked against Henry's desires. Emperor Charles V, Catherine's nephew and the most powerful ruler in Europe, had recently sacked Rome and effectively held the Pope as his prisoner. Granting Henry's request would mean insulting the emperor, something the vulnerable Pope simply couldn't risk. As the Pope delayed and made excuses, Henry grew increasingly frustrated. Anne, meanwhile, introduced the king to religious texts that questioned papal authority, ideas from early Protestant thinkers that suggested kings should rule over the church in their realms, not distant popes in Rome. These radical notions found fertile ground in Henry's desperate mind. By 1531, after years of fruitless negotiations, Henry took the extraordinary step of forcing the English clergy to recognize him as supreme head of the Church of England as far as the law of Christ allows. When his long-serving advisor, Cardinal Wolsey, failed to secure the annulment, Henry destroyed him, replacing him with Thomas Cromwell, who offered a more radical solution: break with Rome entirely. In a series of parliamentary acts between 1532 and 1534, Henry systematically dismantled papal authority in England. The Act of Supremacy in 1534 officially established the king as the supreme head of the Church of England, completing one of the most consequential religious schisms in Christian history. All of this, the break with Rome, the establishment of a new church, the restructuring of England's religious life, stemmed from one man's desire for one woman. Henry and Anne had secretly married in January 1533, when she was already pregnant with their child. In June, she was crowned Queen of England in a lavish ceremony. 3 months later, she gave birth, not to the long-awaited male heir, but to a daughter, the future Queen Elizabeth I. What's particularly fascinating is that despite his dramatic break with Rome, Henry considered himself deeply Catholic in doctrine. He simply rejected papal authority, not Catholic theology. He would later execute Protestants for heresy, even while maintaining his separation from Rome. The English Reformation began not with theological disputes, as it had elsewhere in Europe, but with a king's marital problems, a remarkably personal origin for such a monumental historical shift. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. Monasteries that had stood for centuries were dissolved, their lands seized by the crown. The religious landscape of England was transformed virtually overnight. All of this upheaval, the broken alliance with Spain, the religious turmoil, the execution of those who refused to accept the king as head of the church, stemmed from Henry's determination to have Anne Boleyn as his wife and queen. It was a revolution, born not from lofty ideals, but from the desires of a king who would reshape his nation's destiny for the chance to marry the woman he couldn't otherwise have. Henry VIII's marital history is so infamous that English schoolchildren have memorized it for generations with a simple rhyme: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Dies. But behind this catchy mnemonic lies a tapestry of political intrigue, personal tragedy, and 6 remarkable women whose lives were forever defined by their connection to one of history's most notorious kings. Let's start with Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess who remained devoted to Henry for 24 years. Daughter of the powerful monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, Catherine was a political prize, intelligent, educated, and deeply religious. When Henry cast her aside, she refused to accept the validity of their annulment, insisting until her death that she was the king's true wife. Banished from court and separated from her beloved daughter Mary, Catherine spent her final years in isolated manor houses, forbidden from seeing her child. She died in January 1536. Alone but unbroken, still signing her letters, Catherine, Queen of England. The woman who replaced her, Anne Boleyn, enjoyed only 1,000 days as queen. Initially, Henry's obsession, Anne's failure to produce a male heir, despite giving birth to the future Elizabeth I, quickly eroded the king's affection. By 1536, Henry had his eye on one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting, Jane Seymour. Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister, orchestrated Anne's downfall, bringing charges of adultery, incest, and plotting the king's death. The evidence was flimsy at best, manufactured at worst. On May 19, 1536, Anne was beheaded by a French swordsman specially imported for the occasion, Henry's final gift to the woman for whom he had changed the religion of England. Just 11 days after Anne's execution, Henry married his 3rd wife, Jane Seymour. Quiet, modest, and compliant, everything Anne was not, Jane finally gave Henry what he desperately wanted, a son, the future Edward VI. The king's joy was short-lived, however, as Jane died of childbed fever just 12 days after giving birth. Henry genuinely mourned Jane, later choosing to be buried beside her at Windsor Castle. She was the only wife to receive a queen's funeral during his reign, and the only one to achieve the impossible, dying while still in the king's good graces. After more than 2 years as a widower, Henry was persuaded to make a diplomatic marriage with Anne of Cleves, a German princess he had never met. Relying on a flattering portrait by Hans Holbein, Henry agreed to the match, only to be horrified when he finally met his bride. Calling her a Flanders mare, he complained he was unable to consummate the marriage. Luckily for Anne, she wisely agreed to an annulment after just 6 months of marriage. This cooperative attitude saved her life and earned her a generous settlement. Anne prudently accepted the title of King's sister and outlived all of Henry's other wives, living comfortably in England until her death in 1557. Henry's 5th marriage revealed how dangerous life close to the king had become. Catherine Howard, a young cousin of Anne Boleyn, caught the eye of the now corpulent, aging king when she was in her teens or early 20s. Though Henry called her his rose without a thorn and lavished gifts upon his jewel of womanhood, Catherine's past and present indiscretions soon caught up with her. Her pre-marital affairs were discovered, along with evidence of a current relationship with one of the king's courtiers. Henry was devastated by this betrayal from his perfect jewel. Unlike Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard had no escape route. She was beheaded on February 13, 1542, reportedly spending the night before practicing how to position her head on the block. Henry's final wife, Catherine Parr, was perhaps the most accomplished of all. An intellectual with Protestant leanings who had already survived 3 husbands when the king proposed to her. Mature, capable and diplomatic, Catherine restored order to the royal household and reconciled Henry with his daughters. She came perilously close to sharing the fate of her beheaded namesakes when religious conservatives at court plotted against her. But her quick thinking and humble apology to the king saved her life. When Henry died in January 1547, Catherine was free to marry her true love, Thomas Seymour. Sadly, she died in September 1548 from complications of childbirth. These 6 marriages were never merely personal matters. They were affairs of state that shaped international diplomacy, religious policy, and the future of the English succession. Catherine of Aragon's marriage symbolized the Spanish alliance. Anne Boleyn's union triggered the break with Rome. Jane Seymour provided the male heir. Anne of Cleves represented a Protestant alliance against Catholic powers. Catherine Howard was part of a conservative faction's attempt to control the aging king. And Catherine Parr helped reconcile the royal family while managing Henry's declining health. Each queen brought her own influence to bear on English politics and culture, sometimes directly through policy advice, other times through patronage of arts, education, or religious reform. And each faced the ultimate challenge, surviving the increasingly unpredictable and dangerous affections of a king whose power was absolute. Did you know that Henry VIII wrote more than 70 passionate love letters to Anne Boleyn? If you're enjoying this deep dive into Tudor history, please like this video, share it with your history-loving friends, and subscribe to Modern Age Chronicles for more incredible stories from the past. And tell us in the comments, which of Henry's 6 wives do you think had the most tragic fate? Was it Catherine of Aragon, separated from her daughter and denied her rightful title? Anne Boleyn, executed on trumped-up charges? Or perhaps young Catherine Howard, who lost her head for the crime of having a past? Let us know your thoughts, and let's continue exploring this fascinating chapter of history together. When Henry VIII drew his final breath at Whitehall Palace on January 28, 1547, he left behind a nation transformed. The England he inherited in 1509 and the one he bequeathed to his son, Edward, were essentially different countries, and the ripple effects of his reign continue to shape our world nearly 5 centuries later. Henry's most enduring legacy was undoubtedly the creation of the Church of England. What began as a desperate measure to secure a divorce became a profound restructuring of English society. Before Henry, the Church owned nearly 1/3 of all English land, served as the primary source of education and social welfare, and stood as an independent power that even kings treated with caution. After Henry's break with Rome, The monarchy became the undisputed center of English life, religious, political, and cultural. The dissolution of the monasteries, carried out between 1536 and 1541 under Thomas Cromwell's direction, transferred enormous wealth to the crown and created a new landed class loyal to the Tudor dynasty. Nearly 800 religious houses were closed, their treasures seized, their lands distributed to Henry's supporters, fundamentally altering England's social fabric. Imagine walking through the English countryside today. Those picturesque abbey ruins that tourists photograph were once vibrant communities, silenced by Henry's revolutionary policies. Fascinatingly, despite creating this monumental religious schism, Henry considered himself a defender of traditional Catholic doctrine his entire life. He executed Protestants for heresy while simultaneously executing Catholics for treason when they refused to acknowledge his supremacy over the Church. This contradiction at the heart of his religious policy created tensions that would erupt into bloody conflicts during his children's reigns. Beyond religion, Henry revolutionized English government. Under his rule, Parliament gained new importance, not because Henry believed in democratic principles, but because he needed legislative authority for his unprecedented actions. The English legal system was modernized, with statutes in English rather than Latin, making law more accessible. His establishment of the Navy Royal laid the groundwork for Britain's future as a maritime power. Henry's fleet of about 50 ships would eventually evolve into the force that defeated the Spanish Armada under his daughter Elizabeth. Speaking of his children, Henry's obsession with securing the Tudor dynasty through a male heir ironically led to a succession of 3 remarkably different monarchs, who each left distinctive marks on English history. After Henry's death, his 9-year-old son, Edward VI, continued the religious Reformation, pushing England toward more Protestant doctrines during his brief 6-year reign. When Edward died childless in 1553, Henry's elder daughter Mary took the throne and attempted to restore Catholicism, earning the nickname Bloody Mary for her persecution of Protestants. Her 5-year reign demonstrated how deeply divided England had become over religion. Finally, in 1558, Henry's daughter by Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth I, became queen. Her 45-year reign would be remembered as a golden age, marked by relative religious tolerance, cultural flowering, exploration, and the emergence of England as a major European power. The irony cannot be overstated. The daughter of the wife Henry executed for failing to produce a male heir would become England's most celebrated monarch. A little-known fact about Henry's legacy involves the English Bible. Though he never intended to promote religious reformation, Henry's break with Rome created the conditions for the English Bible to become widely available. The same king who had earlier forbidden English translations allowed the Great Bible to be placed in every parish church in 1541, fundamentally changing how ordinary people experienced their faith. Henry's legacy extended into the very language we speak. His court was the first since the Norman conquest, where English was the primary language rather than French, helping establish English as the language of power and culture. The Tudor era saw an explosion of English literature that would culminate in Shakespeare a generation after Henry's death. Perhaps most significantly, Henry established a principle that would echo through English history: the sovereignty of the state over all other allegiances. By declaring himself supreme head of the Church, Henry asserted that England was an empire unto itself, beholden to no foreign power, a concept that would fuel British nationalism for centuries. Even Henry's personal excesses left their mark. His ostentatious display of wealth, his architectural projects like Hampton Court Palace, his love of spectacle and pageantry, all helped create the enduring image of monarchy that still draws tourists to Britain today. Like all transformative historical figures, Henry's legacy is complex and contradictory. He was a Renaissance prince who stunted England's Renaissance, a defender of faith who shattered religious unity, a man who loved his children yet used them as political pawns. The Tudor rose that symbolized his dynasty represented the union of warring houses, yet Henry himself sowed seeds of conflicts that would trouble England long after his death. 5 centuries later, whether in the constitutional position of the British monarch as head of the Church of England, the distinctive character of Anglicanism, or even in ongoing debates about Britain's relationship with Europe, we are still living in a world partly shaped by the desires and decisions of this most notorious king. To truly understand the seismic shifts of Henry VIII's reign, we must look beyond the crown to the man who wore it, a figure of fascinating contradictions whose personal transformation mirrored the changes he wrought upon his kingdom. The young Henry, who ascended the throne in 1509, bore little resemblance to the tyrannical figure of his later years. Contemporary accounts describe a Renaissance prince in the flesh, 6 feet 2 inches tall, athletic, with a shock of reddish-gold hair and a bearing that commanded attention. The Venetian ambassador wrote that Henry was the handsomest potentate I ever set eyes on, above the usual height, with an extremely fine calf to his leg, and a round face so beautiful that it would become a pretty woman. This vibrant young king excelled at everything he attempted. He spoke fluent Latin, French, and Spanish, wrote theological treatises, and composed music that's still performed today. Did you know that over 30 of Henry's musical compositions survive? His piece, Pastime with Good Company, became a court favorite, and some historians believe he may have written Greensleeves, though this remains debated. Henry wasn't merely a patron of the arts, he was a creator. His physical prowess matched his intellectual abilities. He excelled at jousting, archery, and tennis, often exhausting multiple horses in a single day's hunting. One courtier noted that Henry could tire out 8 or 10 horses and still have energy for dancing in the evening. He loved to showcase his athletic skills, often appearing incognito at tournaments to surprise the crowd when he lifted his visor. Yet, alongside these accomplishments, ran darker currents. Even as a young man, Henry displayed the volatile temper and paranoia that would later define his rule. He was pathologically unable to accept blame, always finding others at fault for any failure. Many historians believe Henry suffered from narcissistic personality disorder, evident in his inability to empathize with others and his explosive rage when crossed. This psychological profile helps explain one of history's most dramatic personal transformations. The handsome, athletic king gradually morphed into the monster of his later portraits. By his 40s, injury and indulgence had bloated Henry's frame. A jousting accident in 1536 left him with a chronic leg ulcer that never properly healed, severely limiting his mobility. Unable to exercise but maintaining his enormous appetite, Henry's waist expanded to 54 inches. His suits of armor tell the story. His final suit required 3 times the material of his youthful armor. The physical pain from his leg, combined with what some medical historians suspect was undiagnosed diabetes and hypertension, likely contributed to his increasingly erratic and cruel behavior. The man who once charmed Europe became feared by his own court. As one observer noted, this king's good cheer, mirth, and pastime is when others tremble and quake for fear. Henry's intellectual interests also reflected his contradictory nature. The same king who wrote a defense of Catholic sacraments against Martin Luther, earning the papal title Defender of the Faith, later broke with Rome entirely. He could discuss fine points of theology in the morning and order executions in the afternoon. By some estimates, Henry executed between 57,000 and 72,000 people during his reign, a staggering 2 to 3% of England's population. His relationships reveal perhaps the most troubling aspect of his character, Henry's ability to discard people once they ceased to serve his purposes. Thomas More, his trusted friend and chancellor, went to the block for opposing the king's religious policy. Cardinal Wolsey, who faithfully served him for decades, was arrested on trumped-up charges and only escaped execution by dying en route to London. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of Henry's religious revolution, was beheaded without trial when political winds shifted. This pattern extended to his marriages. The king, who wrote passionate love letters to Anne Boleyn, who transformed England's religion to possess her, would later sign her death warrant with apparent indifference. When informed of Catherine Howard's execution, he reportedly went hunting. As historian David Starkey observed, Henry's emotional range ran from self-pity to self-righteousness, with little room for anything else. Perhaps most fascinating is how Henry's self-image remained unchanged despite his transformation. Even as an obese, disease-riddled tyrant, he saw himself as the golden prince of his youth. In his final commissioned portrait, a clearly idealized Henry stands with legs planted wide, projecting strength and virility despite his deteriorating health. This disconnect between Henry's self-perception and reality extended to his legacy planning. He genuinely believed his son Edward would carry forward his vision, never imagining that Edward would die young, or that his Catholic daughter Mary would attempt to undo his religious reforms, or that Elizabeth, daughter of the wife he executed, would create a religious settlement that balanced Catholic ceremony with Protestant theology. Yet for all his cruelty and egomania, Henry maintained a certain charisma until the end. He could be generous, charming, and even tender with those in his good graces. Moments of genuine grief punctuated his callousness, particularly after Jane Seymour's death. He was capable of acts of mercy, though these became increasingly rare in his later years. By the time of his death in January 1547, Henry had become a grotesque shadow of his former self. Unable to climb stairs, suffering from chronic pain and plagued by paranoia, he died a lonely figure despite his absolute power. His final words reportedly expressed concern not for his soul or his children, but for the political stability of the realm he had so thoroughly transformed. Henry's legacy endures not just through the institutions he created or destroyed, but through our enduring fascination with his contradictory character. The man who could write both love sonnets and death warrants, who could discuss philosophy while ordering torture, who reshaped a nation to satisfy his personal desires, Henry remains one of history's most compelling, complex, and troubling figures. As winter gripped England in January 1547, the once mighty King Henry VIII lay dying at Whitehall Palace. His enormous body, now swollen and racked with pain, barely resembled the Golden Prince who had ascended the throne 38 years earlier. The leg that had been injured in a jousting accident 11 years before had never healed properly, instead becoming a festering wound that physicians struggled to treat. Few were allowed into the king's chambers. Henry had become increasingly paranoid in his final days, fearful of assassination attempts and whispered conspiracies. The final scene of Henry's life was shrouded in secrecy and fear. Courtiers who had once competed for the king's attention now tiptoed around his sick room, terrified of delivering bad news that might provoke his infamous temper. Even Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, one of Henry's most trusted advisors, was reportedly hesitant to inform the king that his end was near. When Cranmer finally gathered the courage to suggest Henry prepare his soul, the king allegedly responded, "It is well done that you remind me of death, for I trust in the mercy of Christ. We shall meet again." What thoughts passed through Henry's mind as he faced his own mortality? Did he reflect on the wives he had cast aside or executed? Did he worry about the fate of his 3 children, who would each eventually sit on the throne he was about to vacate? Did he regret the thousands of executions he had ordered or the religious turmoil he had unleashed? History records no deathbed confession or moment of remorse. On January 28th, Henry VIII breathed his last. The king who had dominated English life for nearly 4 decades was gone, But the waves of change he had set in motion would continue to shape his nation for centuries to come. Henry's death was kept secret for 3 days, while the royal council secured the succession of his 9-year-old son, Edward VI. When the news finally broke, reactions across England were mixed. Some mourned the passing of a king who, despite his flaws, had ruled England with unquestioned authority. Others quietly celebrated, hoping for a gentler rule under the boy king guided by reformist advisors. In his will, Henry had meticulously planned the succession, arranging for a regency council to govern during Edward's minority and specifying that if Edward died childless, the crown would pass first to Mary and then to Elizabeth. This careful planning showed Henry's determination to preserve the Tudor dynasty he had worked so ruthlessly to secure. Yet even in death, Henry's actions would sow discord. The religious division he had initiated would erupt into bloody conflict during his children's reigns, with Protestants and Catholics trading persecutions as power shifted. When we look back across the centuries at Henry VIII's reign, what should we make of this complex and contradictory figure? Was he a visionary who set England on the path to greatness, or a tyrant whose actions were driven solely by self-interest? The answer, perhaps, lies somewhere in between. Henry's break with Rome laid the foundation for English national identity, creating a sense that England was exceptional and independent from continental control, a perspective that has colored British politics well into the 21st century. The dissolution of the monasteries redistributed wealth and power, helping create a new social order that would eventually evolve into modern British society. His expansion of the navy set England on course to become a maritime power, and the Tudor administrative state he built, with its emphasis on written records and professional civil servants, formed the backbone of modern governance. Yet these accomplishments came at an enormous human cost. Villages that had depended on monasteries for charity and employment were left destitute. Thousands lost their lives for opposing the king's will. Family dynasties were destroyed on the king's whim. And the religious turmoil he unleashed would lead to decades of instability and persecution. A fascinating detail about Henry's physical legacy: when his tomb at Windsor Castle was opened during renovations in the 1800s, historians discovered that Henry's remains had been mixed with those of Jane Seymour. Even in death, he could not be separated from the only wife who gave him a son. Yet the magnificent tomb he had planned was never completed, a fitting metaphor for a reign that transformed England but left much unfinished business. Perhaps most remarkably, Henry's greatest impact came through his daughters, the very female heirs he had considered inadequate. Mary's brief, tumultuous reign would demonstrate the dangers of religious extremism, and Elizabeth, daughter of the disgraced Anne Boleyn, would create a golden age of English power, prestige, and cultural achievement, finding a middle path through the religious divisions her father had created. As we reflect on Henry VIII's legacy, we see not just a king, but a turning point, a moment when medieval England began its transformation into the modern nation we recognize today. For better or worse, Henry's decisions altered the trajectory of not just England, but world history. The Protestant Reformation he reluctantly advanced would reshape Europe. The concept of state sovereignty he championed would become a cornerstone of international relations. And the English-speaking world, with its distinctive cultural, legal, and religious traditions, still bears the imprint of this most notorious king. In the end, Henry VIII reminds us that history is shaped not just by grand ideas and sweeping forces, but by human desires, flaws, and passions. A king's longing for a son, a man's desire for a new wife. These personal motives triggered changes that echoed down to our own time, showing how the personal and political are forever intertwined in the tapestry of human history. Henry VIII was a king who changed the course of history, but at a tremendous cost. His obsession with securing a male heir and his personal passions triggered religious and political transformations. that continue to influence our modern world nearly 5 centuries after his death. From the Church of England that still stands as Britain's official religion to the concept of national sovereignty that shapes international relations, Henry's legacy surrounds us in ways both obvious and subtle. When we look back at the dramatic story we've explored together, the 6 wives, the religious revolution, the political scheming, the executions and triumphs, we're reminded that history isn't simply a parade of inevitable events. It's shaped by human beings with all their strengths, weaknesses, and contradictions. Henry was simultaneously a visionary and a tyrant, a passionate lover and a cold-hearted executioner, a defender of faith and its greatest disruptor. Perhaps what makes Henry so endlessly fascinating is that we recognize something of ourselves in his very human struggle between lofty ideals and base desires. The same king who wrote theological treatises and composed delicate music also indulged his appetites without restraint and lashed out murderously when thwarted. He embodied the Renaissance ideal of the complete man, while failing tragically at the most fundamental human relationships. The Tudor rose that symbolized Henry's dynasty represented the union of the houses of Lancaster and York, ending England's devastating Wars of the Roses. Yet, the deeper meaning of this symbol speaks to Henry himself, a man of stark contrasts, grafted into a single, unforgettable figure who bloomed at a pivotal moment in Western history. As we close this chapter of Tudor history, it's worth pondering what might have happened had Catherine of Aragon given Henry a healthy son. Would England still be Catholic today? Would the English-speaking world have developed its distinctive character? Would the British Empire have evolved as it did? Such questions remind us that history often hangs on the most personal of threads. In this case, a king's desperate desire for a male heir and his passion for a woman who caught his eye at court. When Henry's ornate coffin was lowered into the vault at Windsor Castle on February 16, 1547, the rope broke, sending the king's remains crashing to the floor. A final indignity for a man who had demanded absolute control throughout his life. As the disastrous sound echoed through St. George's Chapel, those present must have wondered if it was an omen. In many ways, it was. The England that Henry tried to control so completely would continue to evolve in ways he never intended, with his daughters ultimately leaving more positive marks on history than the son he had sacrificed so much to produce. If you've enjoyed this journey through one of history's most dramatic reigns, please hit the like button, share this video with friends who love historical tales of power and passion, and subscribe to Modern Age Chronicles for more fascinating content about the modern era. From Renaissance politics to revolutionary ideas, from powerful monarchs to the everyday people who lived under their rule, we're dedicated to bringing the past alive in all its complexity. Which historical figure would you like us to explore next? Let us know in the comments below. Until next time, remember that history isn't just about dates and events. It's about people, with all their glorious contradictions, just like Henry VIII himself.